This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Anticipation growing ahead of President Biden's final meeting with China's leader at the APEC summit. Meanwhile, South Korean President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba to have their own high-stakes talks on the sidelines. Well, Indonesia's President Prabowo pledges to respect global powers but vows to always defend his country's sovereignty amid fresh concerns over a maritime deal with China. And Taiwanese tech giant Foxconn posts forecast topping results for the third quarter as it rides a swelling wave of demand for generative AI. And China's raft of tax policies aimed at boosting the country's ailing real estate market fails to enthuse investors. Ahead on East Asia tonight, we delve into climate finance, an urgent issue delegates are seeking to address at this year's COP29 talks. They want to fill gaps in the support that developing countries need to deal with the effects of climate change. And more than 500,000 South Korean students sit for a crucial university entrance exam known as Sunong locally. See how the country goes all out to ensure it happens without a hitch. World leaders are gathered in Peru this week for the APEC summit amid rising uncertainties brought on by Mr. Donald Trump's imminent return to the White House next year. Well, several notable bilateral meetings will be taking place over the course of the three-day forum in capital Lima, including highly anticipated talks between Chinese President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart, Joe Biden. It would be their third and likely last in-person talks as presidents before Mr. Biden passes the torch on to his successor. The return of the Trump administration is expected to dominate talks as the region anticipates the U.S. to take on a more protectionist direction next year.
Everybody is in a holding pattern trying to figure out what the new position of the U.S. administration will be, and that ultimately must have an impact on the discussions.
It's been 8 years since we have seen a rise in protectionism around the world, and therefore I don't think global leaders are looking at Donald Trump's re-election as an inflection point. That point of no return happened a while ago. We survived 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden. We will take the next 4 years of Trump in our strides.
Well, the Asia-Pacific region is also anticipating slowing growth. The expansion of the 21 member economies has been projected to lag the rest of the world, with growth rates of 3.5% this year, which are set to fall to 2.7% through the end of the decade. A Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is heading to South America for an 8-day working trip to attend both the APEC and G20 summits. Now, Mr. Ishiba succeeded Fumio Kishida in October as the leader of the world's fourth largest economy and Asia's second largest. His meetings with world leaders will be closely watched. CNA's Michio Ishida has this report.
At the summit, Japan will show its support for open trade and investment, as well as multilateral trade systems, which it says are the foundation for its prosperity. It will push for inclusive and interconnected growth and free trade in the Asia-Pacific, as well as sustainable growth, among other issues. But the summits are likely to be overshadowed by a looming Trump presidency in the U.S. Amid concerns over a rise in protectionism, Japan and the UK are set to launch an economic version of a 2+2 dialogue, a regular meeting of foreign and trade ministers that aims to strengthen cooperation in upholding the international economic order. Relations with China will also be on Mr. Ishiba's mind. Local media say the first bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba and Chinese President Xi Jinping is on the cards. Bilateral ties soured after China banned marine products from Japan in response to the release of treated radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant. But during Mr. Ishiba's meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang on the sidelines of last month's ASEAN summit in Laos, both sides agreed to pursue mutually beneficial strategic relations. Mr. Ishiba is also expected to meet South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, while the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. are set to hold trilateral talks as well. Separately, Mr. Ishiba is expected to confirm Japan's unwavering alliance with the U.S. in a bilateral meeting with outgoing President Joe Biden. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Well, lots to unpack here. For more, we are joined by Alex Capri. He's a senior lecturer at the NUS Business School, speaking to us from Stockholm. And we also have with us CNA's Shenzhen correspondent, Deborah Wong. Well, thank you both for joining us this evening. First to you, Professor, let's just talk about this APEC summit approaching amid a Trump 2.0 administration. What are some of the key concerns and priorities you think are likely at the top of mind for our East Asian leaders?
Well, we're seeing already the increase of transactionalism, right? So as the U.S. is anticipated to go more and more to bilateralism, the Make America Great Again platform that Trump has run on, that is not a multilateral focused viewpoint or model, right? So we are already seeing countries getting ready to look after themselves, if you will, right? Looking for more bilateral, looking for more minilaterals that may or may not include the United States.
Right. And Deborah, will this highly anticipated meeting between President Xi and Biden set to take place on the sidelines of APEC? Deborah, what should we expect from their discussions?
So this is most likely going to be the final meeting between President Xi and Biden before Trump takes over in January. So it's unlikely that the meeting will produce any major deliverables. But what we can expect them to do is to discuss the results of the U.S. election. So Trump is coming into power at a very sensitive time. You know, the crisis in Ukraine and Gaza, they're still happening. And we're also looking at cross-strait issues and tensions in the South China Sea. And the Republicans, right now, they have a governing trifecta in Washington. So what that means is Donald Trump would be, you know, it's easier for him to have more authority to pass his policies. And that also includes launching 60% of tariffs on Chinese goods, as well as 20% of taxes on all foreign goods. So President Xi's willingness to meet Joe Biden during this transitionary period also really reflects a desire on the Chinese side to maintain open lines of communication in spite of what's to come. And if we look back in 2016, you know, it's almost like deja vu here, because back then, President Xi also had the same meeting with then President Barack Obama in Peru just before Trump took over for his first term. And back then, they had discussed the importance of maintaining good relations and also preventing the escalation of conflicts. But, you know, with Donald Trump's track record of starting the 2018 trade war and his hardline approach to China that we saw in his presidency, it does appear to be a very rocky road ahead. So now it's a matter of finding areas of cooperation and, you know, amid all these contentious policies. Professor, to you, you know, Trump's choice of officials include Marco Rubio and also Mike Waltz, both men who are known to have very hawkish approach to China. What do you think this would bode for U.S.-China relations?
Well, I think we know what we're getting with both those men. And Marco Rubio has been a China hawk for years. He has been behind a lot of the legislation aimed at China, whether it's cutting off technology transfer. And now I think increasingly it's going to be about looking at outbound investments to China and getting a lot more transparency as to where that money is going and getting as transparent and also a traceability factor in Wall Street's dealings with China. So I think we know where that's going. I think what's interesting about Marco Rubio is he's more of a neocon than, you know, a MAGA Republican. And I think that's going to play out very interestingly when it comes to Trump's tariffs, because I think there's going to be some sort of counterbalancing that's going to have to happen between technology controls and the so-called friendshoring and ring fencing of strategic technologies like semiconductors, which requires cooperation with allies such as South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. So counterbalancing that with the tariffs that Trump is going to be rolling out. And, you know, against China, we're looking at 60 to 100%, 20% tariffs on everybody else. So that, I think, is going to complicate things for Mr. Rubio as he looks to shore up these different alliances around tech.
Well, I've got more questions coming for you, Deborah, but let's just take a quick look at China's expanding Belt and Road Initiative. And more specifically, I'm talking about the Chinese-funded Chanke megaport in Peru, worth more than $1 billion, that President Xi Jinping is expected to inaugurate later today. And it's set to serve as a major trade hub connecting South America to other parts of the world. And it also allows a number of regional countries, such as Chile, Colombia and Ecuador, to skirt ports Mexico and the U.S. to directly trade with Asia. Now, Deborah, that's a very interesting development, a massive one as well. What does that say about China's growing influence in Latin America?
Otelli, I think more significantly here, this megaport project really underscores China's desire to deepen relations with the global south as well as Latin America, and also to reshape what they see as a U.S.-led post-war order. Now, observers are saying that China has taken advantage of all these uncontested opportunities in Latin America, because U.S. has largely ignored that region for a very long time. In fact, President Xi himself has visited the region about 5 times during his term of office, and that's more than what Joe Biden and Donald Trump have done so far. In fact, China is actively engaging local and national governments across Latin America. So far, they've locked in mineral supply chains. They're also even running a satellite tracking station in Argentina for the China space program. And so far, 22 countries in Latin America are under China's Belt Road Initiative. So you can see that the country is increasingly becoming one of the region's largest trading partners as well. And with the megaport project on its way, we can expect that to go up exponentially higher, And China is aside from also reshaping I think domestically what it's concerned about is also the alliances in Latin America, because a number of nations also still have retained diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And, with China seeing that reunification is inevitable, we can expect to see China still try to strengthen the relationships with the remaining nations, with relations with Taiwan. So all these are really in China's favor.
That's right. And China better prepared now for a Trump 2.0. Professor, we know that Trump, he's expressed this many times before, basically disdain for global institutions as well as multilateralism. How do you think this is going to shape the international order? I mean, particularly in relation to China and East Asia, and when he returns to office in January?
I think we'll see an acceleration of the reorganization of the global economy, and I think it will fragment and regionalize even more quickly than it would have under, another democratic administration. I think China will absolutely look to capitalize in the global south in sort of shoring up and strengthening its relationships, certainly in the U.S.'s backyard in South America, as we've seen. I think it will continue to push along the digital Belt and Road as well as the physical Belt and Road. So, the fact that the U.S. will withdraw to a certain extent as a major factor in the global economy when it comes to multilateralism, I think plays into China's hands.
Interesting. And also, we know with all the threats of, 60% tariffs on Chinese imports, there is a high chance that, the U.S. and China, they're going to be increasingly at odds. Professor, do you think then that means the APEC members at some point, or rather even now, they'll be forced to take sides and the sort of implications that would have on regional trade and cooperation?
No question about it. Middle countries are faced with that choice, and particularly when it comes to strategic technologies or the critical technology stacks. So anything to do, for example, with data centers, the cloud, undersea cables, semiconductors, quantum, biotech. These are all strategic technologies that will continue to bifurcate around U.S. and Chinese-centric groupings. And unfortunately, I think for many of the middle countries, including countries like Singapore or Sweden, where I am today, countries are going to be forced to make a choice around those strategic supply chains.
All right. Many thanks for your analysis. It's been great speaking to you. Alex Kupri, Senior Lecturer at the NUS Business School, as well as CNA's Shenzhen correspondent, Deborah Wong. Thanks so very much. All right, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, a host of European carriers making an exit from China. We'll look at what's causing that. Hello again. You're watching East Asia Tonight right here on CNA. It is time for your business news with none other than Roland Lim. So, Roland, Beijing, apparently they've just announced a whole range of these tax policies to boost the property sector. I'm wondering, how did the markets react?
Well, they're going to be reacting to it in the coming days and months ahead, but the immediate response is subdued. Now, Chinese and Hong Kong equities led losses in Asia amid broader declines in the region, as a second Donald Trump presidency continues to weigh on investor sentiment. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index shedding 2% today. Worth noting, however, markets were open for business for the first time under typhoon conditions. This after scrapping a decades-old practice. Authorities lowered the top-tier T8 signal later in the morning. Chinese mainland developers took a beating as Beijing's announcement for a tax cut on home purchases was well anticipated by investors and failed to impress. The Hang Seng Mainland Properties Index declined by 3.6%. Top developer Longfor Group slumping 7%, while China Resources Land lost 4%. The world's biggest contract electronics maker, Taiwan's Foxconn, outdid market expectations in the third quarter as it continues riding the global AI wave. Now, for the July to September period, net profit hitting $1.5 billion, and that's up 14% from a year earlier. Its revenue grew 20% on year to $58 billion, and this marks the firm's fifth consecutive quarter of profit growth. Revenue from AI servers was the main growth driver, which more than doubled in the first 3 quarters of this year from the same period last year. Servers now account for more than 40% of the firm's total revenue. Foxconn sees the robust demand for momentum to continue, with its chief projecting some 2025 to be, quote, the year of AI. It has invested significantly to be part of the AI technology market, but it's now diversifying beyond electronics assembly, pushing into EVs and semiconductors. The bulk of Foxconn's operations is based in China, and it is the country's biggest private sector employer with more than 1 million workers nationwide. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's threat of higher tariffs on Chinese-made products could impact both Foxconn, whose Zhengzhou plant in China is a major iPhone assembly location, as well as a key Apple client. A Foxconn CEO says the firm is keenly watching the policy announcements from the White House, adding that it would continue to increase investments in countries including the U.S., Mexico, and Vietnam. Foxconn shares closed down about 1.7% ahead of the earnings release, given the market volatility arising from Trump's victory. But the stock has gained more than 74% year to date. Now, China's Geely automobile has doubled its profit in the third quarter as the automaker benefits from strong sales and an improved product mix. The Chinese automaker says net profit surged 92% to $340.5 million, and revenue rose more than 20% from a year earlier to nearly $8.4 billion. Now, it sold 1.72 million vehicles this year as of October, up 32% from a year ago. Geely has enjoyed strong sales at home and abroad due to its diverse range of vehicles offered under brands such as Zeekr and Lynk, as well as Volvo. In the domestic market, Chinese automakers are getting a boost from a government subsidy to encourage trade-ins as part of a broader stimulus package. Now, buyers and manufacturers of battery-powered vehicles have benefited since July from a doubling of subsidies to customers, while sales of gasoline cars in China, that's a market foreign brands once dominated, continue to shrink. The China Passenger Car Association says it expects Chinese EV makers to continue experiencing robust demand through to the end of the year. Geely's Hong Kong-listed shares have risen around 69% this year, outperforming the benchmark Hang Seng's 15% rise. Speaking of markets, Japanese markets closing lower for a third straight day despite the yen falling to fresh lows. The Japanese currency shedding 0.42%, currently trading 156.13 to the dollar. And that's its lowest since late July. Now, a weak yen is beneficial for Japan's export-oriented economy, but creates domestic inflationary pressure and hurts foreign investors who are not hedged against currency depreciation. The benchmark Nikkei index closing at its weakest in over a week as tech counters extended their losses. The chip-related shares, Tokyo Electron and Advantest, respectively losing 3.5% and 2.8%, weighing the heaviest on the Nikkei index. Volatility in the South Korean equity market continues. The Kospi had early gains to end almost flat, and chipmakers decline on concerns that Donald Trump's re-election would fuel intense U.S.-China tensions. The government's assurances did little to calm investors. The Korean won weakened against the dollar. European carriers are quietly pulling out of China. Last week, Scandinavian Airlines became the latest carrier to make the exit when it flew its last flight between Shanghai and Copenhagen. CNA's Tan Yu-Guan finds out the reasons for the exodus.
It was a bittersweet farewell at Pudong Airport as the crew checked in for the last Scandinavian Airlines or SCS flight between Shanghai and Copenhagen. Bidding them farewell were the SAF ground staff in Shanghai, many of whom will be laid off. A former cabin crew who used to fly the China route felt compelled to fly all the way from her home in the Arctic Circle to be here to mark the end of an era.
I came here the day before yesterday and going on the last flight and going back today because I'm very sad for the situation. So I just wanted to be a part of the departure and see and let them know that I'm very unhappy on their behalf.
The Scandinavian airline is withdrawing from China after 36 years in the country. It joins other European carriers in withdrawing from the Chinese market. Virgin Atlantic recently withdrew its London to Shanghai service, citing significant challenges and complexities.
A slew of other airlines have also cut or suspended their flights to the Chinese capital, Beijing. They include British Airways, Lufthansa, and Polish Airlines. The pull-out comes after Russia closed its airspace to airlines from the European Union in protest of EU sanctions on the country after its invasion of Ukraine. The detour may not seem like such a big deal on a flat map, but when we see it on the globe, the extent of the detour becomes clear. It's a detour that other airlines from China or other non-EU countries need not take.
Basically, that means at least 2 hours more time, which means more fuel consumption, more crew, more food and beverage. That means higher cost. And meanwhile, the Chinese airlines can still fly over the Russia airspace, and they have the cost advantage. So basically, they also can have the price advantage. These combined together compose a very fierce competition.
This is the most convenient flight for me. So, yeah, I'm sorry if they cancel it.
We are not happy. That's the only direct flight. Because we're going to Copenhagen or we live in Sweden and Shanghai.
有什么办法呢？对吧？我很高兴，我今天能走。我害怕我走不了。很高兴，很高兴，起码今天还是能够坐上飞机的。听说好像很满。
This is very convenient for us. Even I have many friends who is traveling in our company. Now we have to go either Paris or Amsterdam for the SkyTeam Alliance, either Air France or KLM. So it is more than 4 or 5 hours extra for us.
Next summer is expected to bring happier tidings for passengers shuttling between Europe and China. The warmest season, which begins in June, is expected to bring some air routes between the two places back in service. Polish Airlines says it will resume its service between Warsaw and Beijing. Finnair says it will add 4 flights per week to Shanghai. While Serbian Airlines, unaffected by Russian airspace closure to the EU, is planning a new route from Belgrade to Shanghai. But so far there's no word yet if Scandinavian Airlines would ever resume its service to Pudong Airport. Tan Yu-Guan, CNA, Pudong Airport, Shanghai.
And that'll do it for the business news. Oteli, back to you.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, time now for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, we turn to disagreements over the South China Sea. And Indonesia vowing to safeguard its sovereignty in the waters days after signing a maritime deal with Beijing. While the Philippines protests over Beijing's drawing of baselines at a contested shoal. We'll speak with our correspondent, Buena Bernal. You're watching East Asia tonight. Taiwanese tech giant Foxconn posts forecast topping results for the third quarter as it rides a swelling wave of demand for generative AI. Anticipation growing ahead of President Biden's final meeting with China's leader at the APEC summit. Meanwhile, South Korean President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba to have their own high-stakes talks on the sidelines. And Indonesia's President Prabowo pledges to respect global powers, but vows to always defend his country's sovereignty amid fresh concerns over a maritime deal with China. Now, Mr. Prabowo was responding to worries about a maritime deal signed with China last weekend. He said that he's always trying to find possibilities of a partnership. Well, a phrase in the deal said that the two sides reached a common understanding on joint development in areas of overlapping claims. Well, this wording sparked concern in Indonesia, some saying that it could be seen as a change in Jakarta's position on China's claims in the South China Sea. Beijing has clashed with Southeast Asian nations over the South China Sea, which it claims almost entirely based on a so-called 10-dash line that includes the exclusive economic zones of several countries, including Indonesia. The Chinese claim has led to frequent confrontations with Philippine boats. And just today, the Chinese Coast Guard announced it had conducted law enforcement inspections around the disputed Scarborough Shoal. Manila has summoned China's ambassador to protest. And Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos told reporters, quote, "Our position remains the same." For more on this developing story, we are joined now by CNA's Buena Bernal in Metro Manila. Buena, we've got details on the provisional understanding between the Philippines and China last July. That has not yet been officially disclosed, but what do we know so far?
I do know from sources from the Philippines National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea, which is how the Philippines calls its exclusive economic zone and the entire maritime zone in the larger South China Sea that it considers its territory, that this provisional understanding is limited to Second Thomas Shoal, and that this understanding requires that the two nations have a quote-unquote meeting of the minds prior to the Philippines conducting resupply missions to that shoal. Now, that shoal is a low-tide elevation locally known as Ayungin Shoal, where a grounded World War II ship serves as a Philippine military outpost there. And this provisional understanding, for context, was agreed upon after that June 17 incident between the Philippines and China that saw an unprecedented level of violence between these two countries out at sea, which the Philippines labeled as a brutal assault by China that has been the worst in recent history, as it led to the injury of Filipino elite Navy personnel. So the Philippines Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Enrique Manalo, telling me that that understanding has actually achieved results. And the reason for that is, if you notice, no violence has occurred since late July after that understanding was agreed upon by the two nations following that June 17 violence. In fact, 2 successful rotation and resupply missions have been conducted to that grounded World War II ship since that understanding was made. However, I also spoke with the Philippines' retired Supreme Court Associate Justice, Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio, who is among the foremost experts on the South China Sea in the Philippines. And he says that his take is that this meeting prior to Philippine operations out at sea is essentially a form of concession to China. And the reason for that is because the second Thomas Shoal lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. So a meeting with China prior to any Philippine operation, he said, is not contemplated under international law. Now, in response, one official told me that while there is a meeting of the minds, once out at sea, it's already quote-unquote free-flowing for the Philippines. So essentially, he's saying that this meeting does not contain or limit the Philippine operations. And Mr. Carpio insisting that the meeting is a concession. He told me, and I quote, "I don't think the Philippines should concede sovereign rights just because the Chinese are giving us a hard time resupplying Sierra Madre. This understanding," he said, "which neither side agrees what it's all about, will come back to haunt us."
Wow, those are pretty strong words of criticism from Mr. Carpio. What ways do you think did he say that the deal would potentially come back to haunt the Philippines?
Mr. Carpio was arguing that conceding or agreeing to meet with China prior to Philippine operations to BRP Sierra Madre that grounded World War II ship in Second Thomas Shoal sets a bad precedent for the Philippines, because then China can ramp up aggression in other disputed areas and then later on negotiate meeting with the Philippines before it conducts movements in those areas. And so the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Enrique Manalo, however, responding to that argument, telling me, and I quote, "The Philippines' position is maintained in that understanding, and that understanding only applies to Ayungin Shoal," arguing against that precedent-setting argument by Mr. Carpio. He continues, "Resupplying is continuing, and our ship is still there."
All right, thanks so very much for that report, CNA's Buena Banal in Metro Manila. And of course, we have more coverage on CNA TV on the spat between China and Philippines later on Asia tonight from 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. And it will show you how a grounded and crumbling Second World War era ship became a major focal point in their dispute. And also hear from Orly Mercado, a former Philippine Secretary of Defense, who will be joining us for more insights. Now, this year's UN-led COP29 talks in Baku are focused on climate finance, with delegates urged to find $1 trillion a year for poorer countries. Attendees trying to negotiate for a new financial target beyond 2025 to support developing countries and address current gaps in climate finance. Well, CNA's Ilakia Selvaraji and Yasmin Yonkers break it all down for us.
We're in a world that is incredibly complex. There are so many issues that we're facing as a global community, but most of them connect back to the resources that we have on our planet. People are fighting for water, people are fighting for food, people are fighting for land.
We are seeing climate disasters everywhere, and we are losing biodiversity, and even we are losing indigenous communities, languages, endangered languages that we are losing. So we need to do a lot of more things for now.
Now, many people agree that climate change is real. We're literally feeling or seeing its impact daily. Rising temperatures, the extreme weather events, the death and destruction.
And sadly, Ella, it is really human activities said to be the principal cause. So nations have been working on solutions, but transitioning away from fossil fuels, along with adaptation and mitigation efforts, actually cost money.
Indeed, and COP29 in Baku is all about finding the money or climate finance. It's really used to help developing nations with adaptation, and that's preventing the damage of climate change and mitigation. Really any efforts to bring emissions down, isn't it?
And you know, one key issue that nations are trying to negotiate is something called the new collective quantified goal. It is a climate finance mechanism that would replace the annual $100 billion pledge to support developing nations.
The reality is that getting to the 100 billion was difficult in the first place. The developing countries got there late. I think it is good that now, the world has changed since this 100 billion figure was agreed. We now have other countries that have become a lot wealthier, and I think there's a lot more scope for other countries to contribute. And also there is a need to think of the different types of climate finance that we need to finance. So maybe 2 decades ago, there was more focus on mitigation finance, so financing renewables and clean energy. Now that we're really feeling the effects of climate change, there's, I think, a greater emphasis on adaptation finance. And then, of course, there's the thorny issue of loss and damage.
Yes, loss and damage was indeed the focus of COP27 in Egypt. That was 2 years ago. The idea is that the world's most climate vulnerable nations are often not just the lowest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also the poorest. So the deeper pockets should cover the damage.
It's not going to come from the government sector. It's not going to be the individual that makes a difference. It really is the corporate sector. Corporate has the money. Corporate also needs to follow what the consumers are demanding for, right? And yes, transitioning can be hard and expensive in the short term, but long term, the costs are more to be able to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
I don't really see the private sector contributing to loss and damage, so I largely see public financing having to deal with that, right? So the type of climate finance we're dealing with will determine the mix between public and private that needs to go in. But yes, it's essential that we resolve it, and when we have events like we've had in Valencia recently, it truly underlines the need to tackle issues of adaptation finance and also ultimately loss and damage.
Now, yes, I recently attended a panel discussion at INSEAD. The topic of Singapore being a hub for green finance came up, and I asked one panelist if money is the only solution to climate crisis.
Money is not the only solution. As we are seeing during these panels, we are talking about trust, we are talking about political will, and even when we talk as citizens, our actions matter. So our choices in the market, buying something, when we share with our families and our friends, every decision borns there in our interactions.
That's interesting, but Ella, countries like the Maldives, they, for example, consider all finance to be climate finance, since their entire economy and their survival is just so dependent on climate resilience. So efforts to pivot traditional development budgets to finance climate action are increasing, especially when it comes to climate change adaptation.
The world is changing. We see that the topic of EVs and new technology is something that is evolving and it's growing. So at a certain point, you have to decide, do you want to stick with the old world, or do you want to go ahead and be part of that development and be positive part of that development?
But that then raises the question of how innovation is also costly, and consumers sometimes may need to bear some of the costs.
If you look at any kind of sustainable initiative, typically it's a bit more expensive, right? So, for example, we're pushing green fares a lot. So when a customer buys a green fare ticket, they're essentially buying a carbon-free flight. But it obviously costs a lot more. So what we try to do is to spread awareness. We want to make sure that we educate our customers on the importance of going green, essentially. And we see a huge change, especially with the new generation, that are coming in and are actually choosing brands like Lufthansa because we offer green options. Because I think the awareness in the new generation is much more than the generations preceding them.
So it's consumers, the public and private sectors. It is a combined effort, but also a need for mindsets to shift.
I think sustainability shouldn't be cost more than other products and other, especially for the consumer, because in the end they need to work on it. It should be more affordable for everyone. I think, especially in Europe, there's a change at the moment happening in terms of it's a little bit too much negative news on sustainability and how it works, because we have these goals by 2050 in the Green Deal, which is a very good initiative or a very good thing we have to do. But I think it should be more a positive part.
I would say that what has happened really is that sustainability perhaps has matured. It's the stage of storming, coming up with ideas, coming up with targets that we're trying to set up for ourselves, to the stage of normalizing sustainability, to the stage of perhaps integrating sustainability into every aspect of the value chain for ourselves.
But there's no escaping the bottom line. The UN estimates developing countries require around $1.1 trillion for climate finance from next year, and that rises to around $1.8 trillion by 2030.
And then last year at COP28 in Dubai, leaders said $5 to $7 trillion would be needed to green the global economy by the end of this decade.
Well, yes, part of the puzzle is really ensuring climate finance actually helps developing nations and doesn't put them into further debt. And we'll know later this month if the COP29 meeting can pull off a win and revise funding mechanisms. But an agreement is one thing, actual funding is quite another. And that's also the issue of the incoming Trump administration's view on climate change. If the U.S. pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement again, if it stops making addressing climate change a priority, what will other nations do?
I guess for now, our job is to keep tracking the COP29 talks in Baku, which are set to run until November 22nd. I'm Yasmin Yonkers.
And I'm Ilakia Silveraci.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, South Korean students today took on the annual high-stakes, high-pressure college entrance exam, a traditional pathway to social mobility, economic security, and even a good marriage in Asia's fourth biggest economy. And could there be other avenues to success? We find out more with our expert in just a moment. South Korean students have wrapped up an annual high-stakes college entrance exam with a record number retaking the test this year. Well, this comes amid an increase in medical school admissions to address a doctor shortage. Well, this highly competitive test is considered a life-defining event for many high school students. It could determine whether students can get a degree from a prestigious university, seen as the bare minimum for securing one of the coveted corporate jobs in South Korea. Police deployed over 10,000 personnel to escort exam takers and maintain order around the schools.
먼저 수능이 지금 보는 게 모든 고등학교 4학년이 그렇게 처음이기 때문에 굉장히 떨리긴 하고요. 그리고 제 나름대로 준비를 많이 했기 때문에 기대 또한 되는 것 같습니다.
우선 첫째 아이라서 어떻게 될지 너무 떨리고 저부터 떨리고 그리고 주변 사람들이 응원을 너무 많이 해주시다 보니까 그 기대에 좋은 결과를 또 부응했으면 좋겠습니다.
Officials took a series of measures to support those taking the 9-hour exam, such as controlling noise levels, ordering vehicles to go slow, with bus and taxi driver unions agreeing not to honk. A nationwide ban was also imposed on all aircraft takeoffs and landings during the listening portion of the English test. Well, a number of well-known K-pop idols are also taking the exam this year amid their busy schedules. Fans may recognize some of them. Well, Park Ji-hoo, a vocalist and the youngest of Ibun, he debuted in September last year and is enrolled at Hanlim Art School, a prestigious arts high school in Seoul. And Makaya, rapper of rookie boy band Ampersand One, he holds Australian citizenship through his father, striking a balance between his studies and work in Korea. But some artists have decided to focus on their careers. Well, Herin of the girl group New Jeans debuted in 2022 at the age of 16, and she's seen as an icon for Generation Z. Also on this list, Wonyoung from Aibu. We have Enche of Les Seraphim and Hana of 50/50. For idols who don't have to make the tough decision this year, such as other members of New Jeans, Eyelit, among others. Well, they have uploaded messages of encouragement, cheering fans and students on for this key exam milestone. And for more, we are joined now by Professor Nam-gi Park from the Gwangju National University of Education. Well, thanks, Professor Park, for joining us. We hear that South Korea always falls silent at this time of the year, right, for these students taking the Sunang exam. For those who are not sure what this exam is all about, tell us, why is it considered to be such a crucial milestone in a student's life?
Okay, maybe to answer this question, it is necessary to explain the characteristics of Korean university admission system and the relationship between university education and careers and the economic and social features of Korea. I will tell you briefly. Korean university admissions are determined solely by students' 수능, the KSAT scores, and their high school academic score records. So the university admission system is highly transparent, objective, and emphasizes fairness. So even children of high-ranking government officials or CEOs of large corporations, and like you say, Korean Idol, cannot enter their desired universities if their grades are insufficient. And job distribution, like university admissions, is based on objectivity, fairness, and transparency, with individual capabilities being the most important factor. And Korean society, this is an extreme meritocracy of unlimited competition and winner takes all. So the job market is dualized and polarized. So additionally, the social security system is not well established. More specific detail I will tell you later. So due to these circumstances, the 수능 has become a high-stakes exam that determines a student's future.
Yeah, and you know, I can't even begin to imagine the level of competition in South Korea's education system. But what about the role of private cram schools and the financial investments made by the family? So it's not just the students, who feel nervous. Even the family members themselves are, as we heard from one of the moms earlier.
Yes. So South Korea's education system is renowned for its intense competitiveness, which begins at a remarkably early age. Some parents start preparing their children for future academic success as early as kindergarten by enrolling them in English language preschools, which are essentially a form of early cram schools. So as students progress through primary and secondary education, the majority attend various types of cram schools, known as hagwons in Korea. The ultimate goal of this extensive extracurricular education is to ensure admission to a top-tier university. So while graduating from prestigious university doesn't guarantee a bright future, most students and parents still believe it offers the highest probability of success compared to other paths. This belief continues to fuel the competitive nature of the education system, despite growing awareness of alternative routes to personal and professional fulfillment.
But isn't the government sort of worried, like preparing for such intense examination, that the pressure is going to impact their mental and emotional well-being? And it's not difficult to see why people don't want to have children, because it is a very stressful thing on top of having this Sunang exam to sit for.
Yes. Government know about that. But anyhow, still in Korea case, there's no other way except that one. We believe that and we choose that route. So for example, if we don't make students work hard, we don't have any resources except human beings, like students, like our children. In that case, we cannot survive this competitive international society. But only thing that I worry about is if it's too competitive, then like you said, birth rate goes down and many problem comes. So I suggest to my society that to alleviate this problem, maybe Korean society must transition from meritocracy to new meritocracy. I named it. The new meritocracy means implementing a welfare society that encourages work motivation in economic terms. In terms of education, it means educating students to do their best to develop their capabilities, but later feel inclined to share more than 60% of gains with society. When Korean society go beyond being a meritocracy of infinite competition and winner takes all, and become symbiotic society where people care for each other and live happily together, unreasonable, excessive competition will be mitigated.
So, Professor Park,
appropriate.
we only have time for one question, so I just want to make sure I squeeze this one in. I mean, other than alternative paths to success in South Korea beyond just education, say whether you want to be an athlete or you want to be a sports star or an artist, is there other avenues?
Yeah, sure. For example, entrepreneurship. So some individuals choose to start their own business after high school, bypassing the conventional university route. These entrepreneurs may not excel academically, but possesses other valuable skills such as creativity, innovation, or business acumen. However, this path is often seen as more challenging and uncertain than the traditional academic route. So success stories exist, but they are relatively rare and often require exceptional dedication, skill, and sometimes a measure of luck. And some goes to foreign universities. They try to circumvent that way.
So the bottom line is you still need to do well in the Sunang exam to excel in South Korea. Well, thank you so much for your analysis, Professor Nam-gi Park from the Gwangju National University of Education. Well, on that note, it's time to wrap up East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, and on X. Thanks for watching.